Good morning, grade 12s. I trust you are well and keeping up with your work. Today we are going to be looking at the Black Consciousness Movement under the leadership of Stephen Bantu Biko. The Black Consciousness Movement, please note, emerged in the 1960s during apartheid. Please, I'm sure you've heard of the word conscientize. It has actually been placed into the dictionary. It means to educate one politically, socially, and economically, and it has reference to the Black Consciousness Movement. So the Black Consciousness Movement got a lot of its ideas from other organizations such as Pan-Africanism, the Negritude Movement, and the Black Power Movement. So what were these organizations? Pan-Africanist Movement started in USA and had its roots in USA and the West Indies. It was started by the leader Marcus Garvey as well as Webb Du Bois, and it was an organization that was against colonization. So it promoted solidarity and unity among African people and wanted decolonization, because please remember, during this period of time, some parts of Africa, or most parts of Africa, were still colonized by European countries. So the Black Consciousness Movement liked the idea of solidarity and unity. It wanted Black people to put aside their differences of culture, language, tradition, and unite together as one people against the apartheid regime. So in particular in Africa and South Africa, Kwame Nkrumah was influenced by the Pan-African movement. He became the first president of Ghana, and Ghana was the first independent state in Africa. Then we have Anton Lembede, who was the first leader of the ANC Youth League. He was influenced by Pan-Africanism. Then we have the PAC, the Pan-African Congress, which was formed in South Africa by Robert Sobukwe. He was also influenced by Pan-Africanism. The Black Consciousness Movement got its ideas from two other organizations. So the first one being the Negritude Movement. The Negritude Movement consisted of intellectual Black people who went to Paris University. These Black people then came back to South Africa, and they influenced a lot of other political organizations. The aims of this movement were to neglect colonial attitudes and to define Black culture in terms of universal Black values. So the Black Consciousness Movement also aimed to neglect white European ideas. So for Black people to focus on their own Black culture, their own Black pride, and bringing up their own identities, neglecting European cultures. Then our last organization is the Black Power Movement. You guys have learnt about this already. Please note, obviously, that yes, it did influence Black Consciousness Movement ideas, but Black Consciousness Movement did not resort to violence. Although the government portrayed the Black Consciousness Movement as a very violent and terrorist-like organization. But like the Black Panthers, Black Consciousness Movement wanted to uplift the community. They also had self-help schemes for the community. So they were also influenced by Malcolm X's ideas when he became more liberal in the fact that the Black Consciousness Movement wanted Black people to be proud of themselves, proud of their own heritage. So what were the philosophies or the aims of the Black Consciousness Movement? You first need to be aware that the Black Consciousness Movement did not only represent African people, but it also represented Coloureds and Indians, anyone in South Africa who was discriminated against by the apartheid regime. So its philosophy was to represent anyone who was seen as inferior. The Black Consciousness Movement also wanted Black people to acquire liberation, which is freedom, not only from the government or in politics, like the ANC did or any other political movement, but also in their mindset. So Black people must not just defy apartheid laws, and they must not just fight for human rights. They must also go against white superiority. So black people must change their mindset. They must start to believe that they are good enough, their cultures are good enough, reject white ways of life. So what this basically means is that black people need to believe in the value of blackness, that they must fight for democracy, but not just for democracy, but a kind of democracy that promotes equality between black and white people. In accordance to what I've literally just mentioned, Biko coins the phrase, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And this is very important. Biko believed that if black people continue to listen to white people and believe that they are inferior, believe that their culture, their skin color, their religion, tradition, languages are inferior to the white population, then they will never get change. So black people need to break the shackles of their mind and start believing in themselves, start promoting blackness, start rejecting white ways of life. So why did the Black Consciousness Movement emerge? Especially because there were other anti-apartheid political organizations, such as the ANC, the PAC, the ANC Youth League, the ANC Women's League, as well as other organizations. So what happened in the 1960s, the Black Consciousness Movement emerged because all of these other organizations had been exiled and banned. This was after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, so the government passed a banning law, which meant that all these organizations had to operate in secret, and most of the leaders were imprisoned or exiled. So the Black Consciousness Movement had to fill this political vacuum because there were no other political organizations left. So this movement emerged to help black people. During this period of time, as I mentioned, the ANC was around and they started to resort to violence. So MK, Mkhonto we Sizwe, became very popular, but in the 1960s it hadn't really gained any ground. It was only near the 1980s that it started to gain ground. They made use of guerrilla warfare and guerrilla tactics, but again, the territory in South Africa, they didn't have a lot of significance or a lot of effort taking place. So the Black Consciousness Movement took over and tried to help black people. And then once again, I mentioned all the organizations were banned, and yes, there was still the idea of the Freedom Charter, and yes, the ANC was kind of still around, but the Black Consciousness Movement became very powerful and it became a mass movement. We will now be looking at the aims of the Black Consciousness Movement. So as mentioned, the Black Consciousness Movement wanted solidarity amongst the black community. Please remember during apartheid that in black townships there was a lot of tribal warfare among the Xhosa, the Zulu, the Sotho. So the Black Consciousness Movement wanted these tribes to put aside their culture and their differences and to unite against apartheid. It also wanted to serve Africans who were discriminated against. So remember I said it wasn't just black people, it was also Indian people and colored people that the Black Consciousness Movement represented. It wanted cooperation between black and white people, but this could only occur once black people believed in themselves. So the Black Consciousness Movement did not discredit the white population, but it wanted black people to work on their own and to improve their own lifestyles, their own mentality. It believed that black people should liberate themselves and not rely on white people, as I've just mentioned. So self-reliance was very important. Black people had to uplift their own communities. They had to help promote their own culture, their own tradition, their own language, and not rely on white people. So the aim of the Black Consciousness Movement in order to achieve this was to build sustainable organizations on a community level so that black people could depend on themselves. So within homelands or tribal areas, each community could develop feeding schemes, housing schemes, education schemes, upliftment schemes to help the community and the Black population. The Black consciousness movement was pro-Black, but it wasn't anti-white. It wanted Black people to favor themselves. Again, I've mentioned this, it wants Black people to liberate themselves from psychological oppression and to believe in themselves. It wanted Black people to also gain equality to white people in the sense that they could own land and have the same human rights. And it also wanted sharing of wealth in a capitalistic society. So just to sum up the aims of the Black consciousness movement, it's basically for Black people to unite against oppression and to uplift their own communities and gain equality with white people. Now, Biko was involved with many other organizations as a leader. He was involved in other Black activist groups as follows: the University of Natal Non-European Section, as well as NUSAS, National Union of South African Students. He was also involved in the University Christian Movement, the South African Student Organization, the SRC, Student Representative Council, and the Black Consciousness Movement. He was a leader in all of these different groups, and if you can see, most of them are situated at universities focusing on the youth, because the youth would bring about future change. As mentioned, Steve Biko was one of the leaders of the University Christian Movement. The UCM met in 1968 with Biko as well as 248 other Black students in South Africa. The aim of this meeting was to discuss the political future of non-whites as well as the need for Black representative student organizations. Please note, even though I've previously mentioned quite a few organizations that Biko were a part of, most of these were not only Black organizations. An example of this organization is NUSAS. The National Union of South African Students incorporated Black and white people. So what happened was Biko wanted to form SASU, which I've mentioned he was part of, the South African Student Organization, and this was a breakaway organization from NUSAS so that non-whites could represent themselves. So, as I said, in order to gain Black representation, Biko recruited students from ethnic universities, and these students broke away from NUSAS to form SASU. They met in 1968 in Mariannhill and drafted a constitution for SASU. In 1968, then in Turfloor, SASU was set up, and it had its first inaugural conference. It had an inauguration, which means that the first leader, which is obviously Biko among other people, held a speech and an introduction to SASU. And the importance of SASU was to conscientize Black communities and instill them with Black pride, and the aim was to use universities and students to get the Black consciousness ideas around campuses. SASU became the most prominent student organization to be linked with the Black consciousness movement. Because of this, SASU spread Black consciousness movement ideas across university campuses all over South Africa. The Black consciousness movement used the SRC in universities to communicate to students. If you're not sure what an SRC is, it's a Student Representative Council. What happens is, like in school, you have a class captain. In university, as part of your degree or your study sector, like say you're studying art, you will have some like a little parliament or a few people who represent you, and they attend meetings with the university and they let the university know your grievances and things you are not happy with. So the SASU as well as the SRCs worked very close with the Black Consciousness movement. So how did the SRCs help out SASU and the Black Consciousness movement? So the student representative councils were not just involved with university affairs of education, but also with sports. So the SRC used funds from university to hold sports meetings and social gatherings. And it's here during these sports meetings and social gatherings that the Black Consciousness movement used these events as a cover. They would use these events to spread their ideas as a platform to rally new ideas. SASU also had very limited resources. They didn't have telephones, photocopy machines, whereas SRCs in universities had these resources. So they then made these resources available to the SASU organization, which enabled SASU members to communicate to one another across campuses and spread ideas of the Black Consciousness movement. There were, however, some issues. Some non-whites believed that SASU was not a good organization, and it became labeled as a racist organization by white people. Some non-whites didn't want to include coloreds and Indians into the SASU organization, and eventually the government, with SASU gaining ground and gaining popularity, started to ban the SASU organization, and anyone who took part in SASU or Black Consciousness movement ideas would be exiled or taken away or banned from university campus. On the top right-hand corner is an example of SASU members meeting with one another. So these would be SRCs from universities discussing their grievances. Then on your left-hand side, you have the SASU newsletter. This was published and given out to university students to make sure that they could coordinate meetings, events, rallies, sports events. And if you look at the bottom there, there's just an example of an anti-apartheid poster that was put up in different universities. The youth were very attracted to Steve Biko as well as his ideas in the Black Consciousness movement because he was quite a gifted speaker. He was a good orator and people really liked what he had to say. He believed in self-liberation and he inspired many Black people. Remember, I said he wanted them to liberate themselves, not just politically, but also their mindset, the way they thought about themselves. He encouraged democratic participation in decision-making, so it wasn't just him who would make decisions in the party. He would get SASU leaders to make decisions as well, to help out with everyday decisions, to help out with political decisions. SASU and the Black Consciousness movement therefore grew very rapidly. He also, as I've mentioned already, established several self-help groups, and very, very important, he wrote articles in SASU newsletters. Remember on the previous slide, I showed you an image of a SASU newsletter. Now, SASU's role in universities was also to promote Black pride and unity. And obviously it made students more politically aware because these students were being educated through the Black Consciousness movement and they could then spread these ideas across campuses. It also encouraged students to liberate themselves from apartheid, and many students favored SASU. Lots of them started to join SASU. So in addition, Black Consciousness movement further influenced SASU, but also South African student movement. So please note, SASU is university-based, where South African student movement is based in high schools. So the Black Consciousness movement spread among universities as well as high school learners. Many of SASU members who were in university became teachers once they graduated, and they were able to further spread Black Consciousness movement ideas. They introduced these ideas to learners, and they tried to further influence the youth. Many of the SASU leaders who were teachers also tried to make the youth more assertive of their Black identity, so be aware of themselves and be proud of themselves, and tried to also enable them to defy apartheid. The South African student movement, through teachers, helped lots of students to go through leadership training in high school and help them to question politics, question the way society was run. And lots of times these students would then be part of the Black Consciousness movement, and they would start to fight against apartheid. The Black Consciousness movement grew into a mass movement, so much so that the youth organizations of the South African Student Organization and the South African Student Movement had to start their own umbrella body, part of the Black Consciousness movement. So you had the Black Consciousness movement, and underneath that you had the Black People's Convention. This started in 1972, and this incorporated SASU and SASM, which is all the youth. So this was a youth movement, and it was a Black national movement that formed the umbrella body for the Black Consciousness movement. So the youth were the ones who were the driving force behind this movement. And what did they do? Most of their ideologies or roots were in ethnic universities to spread their ideas. Youths and people who were part of the organization were sent into communities to run clinics and literacy campaigns to promote Black pride. So they would literally go into communities and help out sick people and help out people through tutoring programs. They also supported disinvestment campaigns, and they also supported not having foreign investment in South Africa. So what they did was the youth would want overseas companies to no longer invest or put money in South Africa. In addition to all of the above, the Black Consciousness movement, with the help of the Black People's Convention, ran different activities. They started the Zampilo Community Health Clinic. They also opened up the theatre in Alex, and in this theatre it became a platform for Black people to express their history. The Black Consciousness movement renewed the labor movement. Please remember that African people, most of them worked as non-skilled laborers, particularly in mines, factories, and households. With them working as non-skilled laborers, they were not allowed to have trade unions. Remember, trade unions are organizations that represent your rights. So if you have the right to certain working hours, right to certain pay, the right to not get fired. But also please remember, Black people did not have very many rights. So it is in the 1970s that there was an escalation in strike action, and this was due to the spread of Black Consciousness movement ideas. Black people started to believe in themselves and believe that they deserved more. Particularly in 1972, when SASU held its 3rd annual conference, it actually started an organization, the National Trade Union Council. This council or organization would be involved in establishing several smaller trade unions because of the fact that no Black people had rights in their working environment. And I said to you already, trade unions were illegal, so Black people couldn't be part of these trade unions. However, they ignored what the government said, and BAWU, under the National Trade Union Council, was the first trade union formed by Black people under the leadership of Drake de Kotler. It's the Black Allied Workers Union. The Black Allied Workers Union had their first strike in 1973 at the Coronation brick and tile factory in Durban, where 2,000 workers would march to the factory. They demanded higher wages. They chanted, "The man is dead, but his spirit lived on." So because of the strike action, it was influencing other areas, and it moved to other areas eventually, particularly the East Rand. So once black people got courage to strike in the Coronation brick and tile factory, so did they get the courage to strike in other areas. And this was thanks to the spreading of Black consciousness movement ideas. So what is really important about strike action? We are going to be looking at 6 different things. So number 1, because of colonization, we are aware that Africa had a large amount of resources, and these resources were exploited, as well as black laborers. So because of strike action, black laborers were now empowered to strike and to fight for improvement of their rights in particular in the working place. Number 2, African workers were now equipped with organizational skills from the trade unions. They would learn how to organize strikes. They would learn how to run a trade union. They could partake in civil society protests. Number 3, trade unions were democratic, so African workers were involved in decision making. They were not just told what to do and when to do it. They could actually partake in decision making. Number 4, strike action affected the government economy, and it forced the government to step back and actually listen to what African people wanted. Because if you think about it, mass strikes are happening all over the country, which means factories are not open and employees are not working. Products are not being made. So this has a negative impact on the economy. Number 5, the Vyham Commission was set up. This was set up by the apartheid government, and it was set up to assess the labor laws in South Africa. And because of this Vyham Commission, the labor laws were actually eventually changed in South Africa. Then lastly, in 1979, the Labour Relations Act was passed by the Vyham Commission, and this granted black workers the right to form registered trade unions and embark on legal strikes. So they first had to register their trade union, and their strike action would be legal. So how did the government perceive the Black consciousness movement? What did they think about this movement? So please remember, at first the government didn't mind, because they developed homelands for black people. They developed non-skilled jobs. They developed other trade unions for black people. So separate development was allowed. But as soon as any black organization influenced white population or influenced a change in apartheid, then the government would take notice of it, and they would not be happy about this. So obviously at first they were not concerned about the Black consciousness movement. They allowed it because it was black people breaking away from white organizations, forming their own organizations. They were okay that SASU broke away from NUSAS because it was black people developing on their own. But as the Black consciousness movement gained ground, as it became a mass movement and started to challenge the state, the government started to become aware of this movement. Because of the fact that Steve Biko was such a powerful and strong leader, the apartheid government started to be aware of him. They started to reject Black consciousness movement ideas. The Black consciousness movement also helped workers participate in strikes. It also helped workers support disinvestment. And as soon as this affected the white economy, the white social structure, the white politics, the government took notice. So how did the government react? In 1971, all Black consciousness movement speakers were banned from speaking in public, and 8 South African student organization leaders were banned. The government during this period of time then used white media to discredit the Black Consciousness Movement. They made the Black Consciousness Movement seem like a terrorist organization. So a lot of the white population was afraid of the Black Consciousness Movement. In 1794, 80 people from the Black People's Convention were also imprisoned without a trial. And in 1795, SASU leaders were banned from talking at university campuses. So do you understand? At first, it didn't really have a problem with Black Consciousness Movement, but as it grew and grew, it started to affect the apartheid government. We are now going to look at the tragic murder of Steve Biko. This is known as a crime against humanity, and it was the apartheid regime who organized his murder. Please remember that Steve Biko was under a banning order from 1973, which meant that he could not leave his hometown, King Williamstown. And if he did, he would then be imprisoned. So it was illegal for him to leave his hometown. He, however, decided in 1977 that he would like to go to Cape Town because he wanted to address the youth and have a mass rally in Cape Town. Unfortunately, he was stopped by a white police officer on his way to Cape Town, and this police officer took him into custody, realizing who he was. While under custody, he was placed in a jail cell where he was interrogated. During interrogation, he did try act peacefully and give the police officers what they wanted, but they continued to beat him, to torture him. They even used a hose pipe to hit him with. They would push him against the wall, so much so that he eventually got brain damage and bleeding on the brain. So obviously, if this happened, you need to see someone. It was only 6 days later that they called a doctor to consult for Biko. The doctor said he has severe injuries and really needs to go to a hospital, but the police officers were afraid that Steve Biko might escape. So as previously mentioned, Steve Biko did need to see a doctor, but the police were afraid that he would escape, especially if he were to see a doctor in Cape Town, because he could easily get back home to King Williamstown where he could be hidden. So what they decided was to take Steve Biko to a hospital in Pretoria, which was 1,000 kilometers away. So they threw him in a van, and eventually in transit, Steve Biko died. So it was obviously the police's fault in why he died. At first, when questioned about the murder, the police officers told the public that there was no beating or torture connected to Biko's death. And the public couldn't disprove them because his records, his death records, were never released. Another statement by the police was that Biko got a head injury when they tried to restrain him and he went berserk. They also stated that Steve Biko went on a hunger strike as well. Only recently have the police confessed the truth about Steve Biko's death and taken responsibility. But at the end of apartheid, these police officers still did not get imprisoned for Biko's death. And as a result of Biko's death in 1977, the apartheid government banned all black organizations. And this is when organizations started to operate underground, when they started to use their military wings, like Umkhonto we Sizwe and POCO, which was the PAC's military wing. In front of you is an image of Steve Biko, and if you look there, there's top images of him after his autopsy. This image was not allowed to be published because obviously the police lied about his death. And if you look at this image, his face is very swollen and he was actually beaten to death. So this image was taken illegally and it was never actually really shown to anyone during the apartheid era. Underneath the image is image of Steve Biko's funeral, and you have the black population carrying his coffin, and they are holding up the Black Power fist. So they are in support of the Black Consciousness movement. Black Consciousness Movement left behind a legacy, a memory of this organization. So please note, when Steve Biko died in 1977, all other Black organizations were banned, as well as the fact that Steve Biko's autopsy report was never released. So there was some kind of impact, some kind of memory left behind by the Black Consciousness Movement. So what is this? The Black Consciousness Movement revived the struggle against the apartheid government. It influenced students, labor movements, strike action to take place. It also influenced Black people to fight against apartheid, to gain their freedom, to not just sit back and watch things happen. So Black people also now started to believe in themselves, to take pride in their culture as well as their traditions. Then most important event is in 1976, the Soweto Uprising. This was when students protested against Afrikaans being spoken in schools. And this was a mass protest, and the Black Consciousness Movement influenced these students to partake in this protest. Another important event is in 1978, when ZAPO, the Zanian People's Organization, which is an organization based in Africa, based in our border states. So ZAPO started to spread Black Consciousness Movement ideas, started to reject white people's help. So Black Consciousness Movement ideas did not just spread throughout South Africa, but also throughout our border states. In 1998, the Steve Biko Foundation was formed, and this foundation gave money to organizations to help them protest for Black values, to help community development. So this foundation would uplift communities, give them feeding schemes, learning programs, community centers. Another thing that was also important is a Steve Biko Center that has been opened in Johannesburg. It incorporates a museum, an archive center, and a community media center as well. And now, during the 2000s, this period of time, there are annual lectures held to commemorate Steve Biko. So these are just a few things that he has left behind for his memory. There are several more that commemorate Steve Biko.